Hello everyone, and hello Bionic Dance. As promised, here is my full response to our discussion and comments which occurred to you during your response to Chris's video responding to you. To everyone else, what this is about is we're arguing about words, about definitions, and about etymology. What is it and what the proper use of it is. I'll do my best to keep it amusing. A little bit of background. For some time, Bionic Dance has been championing defining words based on the meanings of their historical parts and calling it going by the etymological definition. Most notably the words atheist and agnostic. In her words, she says that etymologically the word agnostic means without knowledge, and that's it. That's a direct quote from our comment exchange, which I'll link below. She also says that linguistic disputes would be fewer if more people used her type of analysis for finding definitions. I find those claims to be troubling, to say the least. Working from arbitrary suffix and prefix definitions forward to the meaning of a whole word is not what etymology is or how it's used. Seriously, defining words by their historical parts is almost exactly backwards as far as how language develops and changes. If Bionic Dance wants to be the patron saint of a great Western rectification of names, she should go check with Confucius on how this went in China first, since he embarked on a project of similarly quixotic nature and scope, and failed, despite having a much larger metaphorical subscriber base than any of us ever will. It doesn't matter what you think language ought to be, it is what it is, and you might as well be telling penguins that they should be able to fly because they're descended from birds that could, for all the effect you'll have. Even if penguins do develop the ability to fly, it wouldn't be because of what their ancestors were doing. It would be because of the pressures that are on them as they adapt. I'm not going to leave it at that, though, because this is something that's been gnawing at me for some time, and I'd like to say my piece and then wash my hands of this foolishness. And I'm not talking about people. I don't know you, Bionic Dance. I don't know any of the people who are making these arguments about etymological definitions, but I am reasonably familiar with this argument, and it is silly. It is foolishness. And if you haven't gotten why I think so yet, you will by the end of this video. Again, nothing personal. If I persuade some of you, fine. If I don't, that's also fine. We'll do what we do, and the complex evolving system that is the English language will continue to be larger and more robust than we can imagine, even with as tangled and as difficult to understand and use as it can be. First, what are words? What are these things I'm throwing at this microphone that are coming out of your speaker or headphones and hitting your ear? They're patterns of sound with exactly no meaning. This may sound counterintuitive, but it's true. The meaning lies in my mind and in yours, in the fact that our social environment has encouraged us, has shaped us to have similar concepts with the word that I'm saying and the word you're hearing. This breaks down an awful lot, but that's because the dictionary definition of a word is often no better than a one-dimensional, two-dimensional at best, shadow of the solid object or concept that a person associates with it. Read the dictionary definition of puppy, and then think about a puppy, or hug a puppy, to illustrate the difference between a word, a concept, and an actual thing. Words are used to relay things that we experience to other people, or to record them for later recollection by ourselves or others, however dimly. This means that even between individual uses, the meanings of a word will always change. And yes, I mean meanings. That's why we have multiple meanings in a dictionary. For example, the next person to hug that particular puppy may get piddled on. That person over there will be hugging a different puppy than you did. That other person hates puppies and likes cats, and that last person is allergic to fur. This applies to theological and philosophical concepts as well, because different people will have different intellectual and emotional perceptions and recollections regarding the concepts discussed, and this will have a great impact both on how they understand and use the terms. Just to remind you, I'm not examining the definition of agnostic here, because I have access to many dictionaries that can provide for me what the current definition of the term agnostic is, the current definitions of the term agnostic. That's because that's what dictionaries of the English language do. They describe what current usage is, what the most accepted usage is. It's a war between, it's a tension between what people on the street are doing and saying and the standard people would like to impose, and what people are doing and saying always win, which is why y'all and ain't are becoming commonly accepted over time. Why irregardless will unfortunately become commonly accepted if things continue, and why the Oxford comma has been dropped. Language changes because people are using it, and therefore it changes as people use it, not as we would like it to. If you want a prescriptive dictionary in a language that is supposedly controlled by some authority and supposedly maintains its purity and rigor, then if you want a language that is so adamant about not having cognates from languages like English, like blue jeans, imported into their language to the point where they make up their own word and say that is our word for blue jeans, then go speak French, because that's exactly what they do. They beat off cognates with a stick, all right? They attempt to rigorously impose meanings and pronunciation and vocabularies regardless of what people on the street are actually doing. And they have a lot of power within France to affect what language business uses and what language the government uses. So they actually have a little sway there. So maybe you should try that. Although I'm starting to wondering whether in a few generations we're going to have a high French and a low French. The language is going to split if it hasn't already, but that's another discussion. A more extreme example of this sort of phenomenon would be imposing definitions after the fact, is how someplace like Conservapedia attempts to rewrite the pages of reality on the pages of its wiki. It rewrite whole histories simply because it wants, for political reasons, Andy Schlafly wants the definitions of words to have particular meanings, wants particular historical terms and names to reflect his bias. And of course there's the example of Variablast, who has attempted to recast 2 words at least from whole cloth. But in all honesty, I really did like the idea of reclaiming the word atheist as non-theist or without theism or however you want to translate it, and taking ownership of it, having atheists try and take ownership the way that other movements have attempted to do with other words with some degree of success. And this is because I feel a bit more of an emotional attachment to that word, since, well, when you mention that word, you're mentioning a quality I have, depending upon your understanding of the word. But as time went on, I realized that there is a tremendous difference between wresting control of a term that is used at you as a pejorative and telling other people that they should use a word a particular way because that's how you understand it, and it's more convenient for you, and you think it would be more convenient if other people understood it that way as well. The first is pride in self, whether it's the right way to do things or not is another discussion. And the second is unwarranted arrogance, and not to mention it's unenforceable. Just as such a battle is going over the word feminism, and Rush Limbaugh, the MRAs, and Fox News have all been bashing dedicated activists for human rights. Human rights. over the head with what you would call the etymological definition of feminism in an attempt to recast the movement as a group of female supremacists? Are you really willing to take this etymological defining of words as your weapon when it cuts both ways in our very, very messy language? Do you really think this will make things clearer if at any point someone could snatch some arbitrary historical suffix or prefix or combination out of thin air and throw it at you to turn what you have said into what you consider an abomination? Just asking. Which leads me to examine etymology more specifically. It is not a toolkit for reassigning definitions to words. It's not. It's the study of how words emerged and changed over time. How they've been shaped by culture, merged and broken off from others, and generally been adapted, since words themselves do not adapt, to fit the environment they are in. Picking a set of phonemes and assigning definitions to them based on the dead meanings of subsets of those phonemes at very specific historical moments in time, and only one of the several possible definitions of that, is a fool's errand. While you're busy doing this, 16 gazillion other people are subtly shifting the definition of the word by using it in a more modern context to describe a mental association they are having at that very moment. And I do have to tell you that in a conflict between the living and the dead over language or history or a mixture of both, such as etymology, even when you take into account zombies who, though they are very strong, they have a very limited vocabulary, the living will always win. Just to make sure those two interrelated points about etymology are made clear, along with how intimately connected they are. First, each time a word is used, its context and therefore the meaning are subtly different than the last. There is no a word out there to point at. There is a recurring phenomenon of the expression of a concept with a word that happens over and over and over and over again, that never happens the same way twice. Just like waves that look similar as they crash into the beach, but aren't. Second, as new generations arise and old ones pass away, or even as we as individuals get older, the meaning of words change as new contexts and viewpoints arise, and other ones are lost except through the lens of historical record, which, being largely made of words, is necessarily incomplete. Etymology in English is attempting to trace the progression of these changes without access to the minds that forged and used these words, or held these concepts. Therefore, they're not around to explain it to us in terms that our differing perspective can understand as their historical perspective did. So it's not precise, and it's definitely not about repairing definitions from what parts you can find in the spares bin. There is one, and I mean one, exception to this that is accepted, but not necessary. It's not necessary to do this by any means. There is no standard in the English language requiring this. Often when someone is attempting to coin a new word, for instance Richard Dawkins and meme, they will build upon Latin or Greek roots to try and give their neologism a sense of historical basis, a sense of tradition, and to fit it in with the existing language, hopefully increasing the odds that it is generally adopted. But recasting an old word, that's public relations. That's strange. But speaking of French and the dead, a cognate from French is one of my most favorite examples of how etymology does not create truths now. It reveals them about the past. And by create truths, I mean create new definitions of words, except when people commonly use them. And if what you're trying to do is sort of behind the scenes push people into commonly using it your way so that it then becomes what you are saying, which is correct, then what you're doing is dishonest, because you're declaring yourself victorious before you have won victory, which again is PR or propaganda, foolishness, and annoying. But I can't read your mind, so I don't know what you're doing. I'm just attempting to access this from all angles, because I'm going to be done with this when I'm finished with this video. But the word mortgage literally comes from the words death and pledge, which has a number of interesting interpretations if you look back at it. A number of different speculations as to why this term for mortgage exists. And my favorite is the one that the buyer is just as likely to die as to pay off the debt. And of course, when they do pay off the debt, or when they do die, the property and the preceding payments that they actually did get, of course, revert to the lender or seller. But most interestingly, the French don't use that particular term anymore. Maybe because they got PR. So rather than chopping up living words and sewing the dead parts together in a strange echo of Dr. Frankenstein's misguided and fictional efforts, I strongly suggest you look around at the words and the people who are using them and see what they are actually doing and actually are, and attempt to actually use them rather than coerce them into being something they're not. Because that's the reality you have to deal with. That's how we communicate, and that's how we're going to communicate, whether you want to do it or not. Thank you for your time and attention.